This is the Cortex Athletic Review. I'm your host, Evan Carrillo, and each week I dive into the research to distill and relate sports science and psychological peer-reviewed literature to modern-day coaching and athletic development, with a slight bias to hockey goaltenders. Now that I think about it, I haven't bought a new pair of shoes in like 3 years. I've always been more of a function over form guy with my shoes, so as long as they still work, I'm going to keep on using them until my wife decides it's time to just throw them out. But I do like the look of a nice clean Nike Jordan 1, which carries the name of famous Major League Baseball player Michael Jordan. That's a weird sentence that technically existed for a brief, confusing moment in the 1990s. Michael Jordan stepping away from the NBA at the peak of his career to try professional baseball is such a weird and fascinating story for any number of reasons. But for me, I've always been drawn to the multi-sport element of it and just the logistics of an athlete being able to jump from one domain to another like that. Even within the same sport, positions have such specific roles and skill sets it would be difficult, if not impossible, for pros to sidestep from one position to another and expect the same degree of success. Some sports seem like a good natural fit, when it comes to skill transfer at least. Aside from some running and throwing, baseball and basketball does not seem like an obvious skill transfer. With Jordan, I suppose things like strength and stature, competitiveness, mental makeup, and general athleticism would probably serve someone well in just about any sport. Then there's the matter of even getting your foot in the door at pro baseball without coming up through the ranks. But in Jordan's case, what minor league baseball team wouldn't want the attention and boost in sales of a future NBA Hall of Famer taking a run at a new career? Like, what a story. But perceptually, those two sports live in very different worlds. I've gotten a lot closer with basketball over the last number of years as I've had to coach my school teams. I've never really cared about basketball, to be honest, but it has grown on me. The more I've learned about it, the more I've had the chance to coach alongside people who actually know the game. It is always enjoyable to witness an expert at work, someone who's just really good at what they do. And over time, I've come to the realization that basketball might actually be the best sport a goaltender can play in the offseason. That's a bold claim, I know, especially when baseball and racket sports exist, which I'm also really high on for goalies to play. I've got a few reasons why I like basketball for goalies as a peripheral sport, and it has nothing to do with conditioning or jumping. The first reason is purely psychological. A tight defensive basketball game might see your team still give up 50 points. Shutouts just are not a thing, at least in games where teams that actually belong on the floor together are playing. Perfectionist outcomes just don't exist. Basketball players abide by the doctrine of not letting perfect be the enemy of really good. A big difference between basketball and hockey is that a dominant player in basketball has a much greater impact on the outcome of a game just by way of being bigger, faster, or a really good shooter. They're just going to outreach their guards and they're just going to score. In hockey, dominant players are impactful, of course, but they have less of an impact on the outcome as teams can tactically contain them more effectively. Since the overwhelming majority of the game is played with the puck on ice level with limited options, where basketball is played more in what's called the second floor, the plane that the ball lives in above the court that some players just don't have the same access to. When you give up a basket, there's no time to run through your mental reset routine. You just inbound the ball, you get back up court, and strike back. There's no pouting, no ceremony, no stoppage, no time to spiral. You actually learn very quickly that whatever just happened, it's already irrelevant. Another reason basketball stands out to me as a good complementary sport for goalies lives more in perception. There's a fairly consistent idea in the research that multi-sport participation can be greatly beneficial, but not in any random way in the sense that any sport will do. There's some researched and documented correlation that the benefit seems to be the strongest when the sports are different, but you still have to solve similar perceptual problems. Not so much the same movements, but similar reads. Sports like basketball and lacrosse share a lot with hockey. End zone scoring, dense player traffic, continuously anticipating intentions of others rather than reacting to a single object, reading who is about to act and not just where a puck or ball is right now. Comparing that to something like baseball or volleyball, great sports and incredibly difficult to perform at a high level, don't get me wrong. But the perceptual problems and the playing environment are just so fundamentally different. They're discrete events, clean sight lines, different attack and defense structure. The reads don't overlap in the same way that they would for more similar sports. That leads into my third reason basketball might be especially valuable for goalies. It might be training a visual perception system that hockey doesn't stress nearly as much, not due to any sort of oversight, just by the nature of the game itself. That's where today's paper comes in. The study I want to use today is an older one, originally published in the mid 2000s by two Russian researchers, Oleg Goncharov and Natalia Emelianova. It's called Impact of Athletic Activity on Development of Perspective Constructions, and it was published in the Journal of Russian and East European Psychology in 2012. Right away, a couple of things just to get out in the open. It is old, it's translated from Russian, and it uses a term you almost never hear anymore: reverse perspective. That term didn't exactly survive the test of time or intuitiveness. You won't find modern sports science papers talking about reverse perspective, and for good reason. The field just moved on to cleaner language and better measurement tools. But that doesn't mean the idea underneath it disappeared. In a lot of ways, it actually did the opposite. What the researchers were interested in wasn't drawing ability or art or whether kids understood perspective correctly. What they really wanted to know was this: does the type of sport a child plays selectively shape how they perceive space? And more specifically, does it shape perception differently depending on the spatial plane the sport primarily lives in? The researchers compared about 60 young basketball players and hockey players at the U13 level who had already been playing their sport for at least a few years. Then they gave them a deceptively simple task. They were looking at real, simple geometric objects like rectangular blocks and cylinders placed at different distances in front of them. In one condition, two identical objects were laid out side by side, so along the horizontal plane, one closer and one a little bit further away. In another condition, two identical objects were stacked one above the other, emphasizing the vertical plane. The objects were physically the exact same size, the only thing that changed was how far away they were. The kids either had to draw what they saw or choose which drawing best matched the scene. So any difference that showed up wasn't because the objects were different, it reflected how depth was being represented depending on how the objects were oriented, vertically or horizontally. The researchers had absolutely no interest in drawing skill or anything like that. Instead, they were looking at how size and depth were represented depending on the orientation direction. In other words, when space extended away from you, did it get stretched more along the vertical plane or more along the horizontal plane? The findings suggested that there was, in fact, a statistically significant difference. Basketball players tended to stretch space along the vertical plane, where hockey players tended to stretch space across the horizontal plane. Not because one group was wrong, but because each group had spent years solving spatial problems in very different action spaces. Think about where a basketball and a hockey puck spend the majority of a game. With basketball, the sport itself lives in this area called the second floor, an additional plane above the court. Hockey lives primarily along the ice. The way space was perceived and represented quietly reflected that. An important note is when I say basketball players exaggerated space vertically, that doesn't mean they saw the world incorrectly by any means. It means the vertical plane was weighted more heavily in how their perception organized space. This isn't done consciously, and it's also not a mistake. It's simply an adaptation. Vertical precision is perhaps a more consistent demand, and it can be the difference between rebounding successfully or not. And it makes sense that the brain might stretch that dimension, increasing vertical sensitivity. Not to be accurate in an abstract sense, but to be useful. The term authors used to describe this pattern was reverse perspective. And it's worth pausing on that for a moment because it could use a little bit of unpacking. Reverse perspective was their way of describing a situation where a farther object ends up being represented as larger than a nearer one. Not because the child thinks it's larger, but because depth in that direction is being stretched in representation. So in this case, basketball players were more likely to stretch space along the vertical plane, and hockey players along the horizontal plane. The problem is that term itself is a bit clunky. It comes out of an older, more art and drawing based tradition of perception research. And if you hear reverse perspective, it almost sounds like an error, like somebody has done something wrong. It did not stand the test of time, and that's not how we describe this phenomenon today. Modern perception research wouldn't frame this as a distortion of space, it would frame it as selective weighting, certain dimensions of space being treated as more important because that action demands it. That's why I'm not going to lean on the term reverse perspective that much beyond this point, even though it was part of the original article. Not because the finding was wrong, but because the language hasn't aged particularly well. A more useful and modern way to think about it is through the lens of perception action asymmetries. Perception doesn't develop evenly in all directions, it develops around action. The part of the world that you have to act in under time pressure with consequences gets more perceptual attention. Other parts quietly get less and less. That doesn't mean perception is flawed, it means it's selectively tuned and may become asymmetrical. Your brain isn't trying to build a perfectly even and accurate map of reality, it's trying to support successful action. And once a sport answers that question over and over and over again, perception will adapt accordingly. If a sport lives primarily in a certain spatial plane, perception becomes sharper and more sensitive in that plane. Not because the athlete chooses it, but because that's where mistakes are punished and success is rewarded. Basketball lives far more in this vertical plane, whereas hockey lives far more in this horizontal plane. And over time, perception bends towards those demands. I don't have research to support this, but I'd suspect that for goaltenders, hockey is mostly horizontal. Vertical absolutely comes into play when looking over screens and tracking shots of varying heights, but up until those moments, goaltenders are mostly resolving actions on a horizontal plane. Even when we talk about depth or challenging, we're talking about it along the ice, not in the second floor above it. But hockey still has a vertical element. Screens live vertically, deflections live vertically, releases and shots and rebounds change plane vertically. That's not a technique problem, it's a perceptual one. And this is where basketball becomes more and more interesting to me. Basketball forces you to live in that vertical plane. The ball is constantly changing height, players are constantly changing elevation, action moves up and down, not just left and right, forward and backward. And you don't get to stop the game to reset your perception. You're reading who's elevating, who's coming down, and who's about to act in the air, in real time, under traffic, with bodies in the way. That's repeated exposure to vertical perception problems, a different action space. A few closing thoughts before I wrap up this episode. This episode is not a claim that basketball will fix goalies who struggle to reach shot height, nor is it a claim that playing more basketball will improve a goalie's vertical read on a shot where it's going. It's not a prescription or a magic bullet by any means, and it's not a substitute for hard hockey specific training either. The logic here just doesn't support that, and neither does the spirit of the paper. What this research does suggest is something more modest and probably even more useful. That perception develops unevenly, that it reflects the problems a sport repeatedly asks you to solve, and that complementary sports may expose athletes to different perceptual demands without explicitly trying to train them. In other words, this isn't about transferring a skill, it's about broadening the perceptual landscape that an athlete grows up in. Once you start thinking that way, the question shifts. Not what drills should goalies do, but what perceptual problems are they actually being asked to solve, and which ones might they rarely see at all? That does it for this week's episode. This is being released in early January, so Happy New Year. New episodes are released every week, bright and early on Thursday mornings at 6 a.m. Mountain Standard Time. You can find these episodes and this show on Apple, Spotify, and wherever else you get your podcasts, as well as YouTube at my channel, Cortex Goaltending. My name is Evan Carrillo, and this is the Cortex Athletic Review. Thanks for listening, and stay out of your own way.